It didn't begin with a game. There were no masked guards, no giant dolls, no arenas hidden on remote islands. It began with something far more ordinary. A man losing his job. In South Korea, years before Squid Game ever existed on screen, thousands of people were quietly falling through the cracks of a system that promised stability but delivered competition. For decades, citizens were told that if they studied hard, worked long hours, and remained loyal to their employers, they would be protected. The promise was simple. Effort would lead to security. But promises began to collapse. Factories closed, companies restructured, workers were suddenly told they were no longer needed. In 2009, during the aftermath of the global financial crisis, one such collapse occurred at SsangYong Motor Company. More than 2,600 workers were laid off almost overnight. These weren't new employees. Many had given decades of their lives to the company. Families depended on those wages. Homes were built around that income. Futures were planned around it. When the layoffs came, there was no gradual transition, no safety net strong enough to catch them. The workers protested. They occupied the factory. They believed that if they stayed, if they resisted, someone would listen. What followed was violence. Police helicopters circled overhead. Tear gas filled the air. Workers were dragged out. Some were beaten. The strike lasted 77 days, but its effects lasted far longer. In the years that followed, reports emerged of former workers suffering from depression, illness, and suicide. Entire families were destabilized by one corporate decision. This was not called a crime. It was called restructuring. Around the same time, a filmmaker named Hwang Dong-hyuk was struggling in his own way. He wasn't famous yet. He wasn't successful. He was broke. He had difficulty finding work. He sold personal belongings to survive. He watched people around him fall into debt, despair, and invisibility. And during this period, he began writing a story. Not about heroes, not about villains, but about people who had already lost. The idea was simple and terrifying. What if individuals crushed by debt were offered a chance to reset their lives through a series of games? What if the games were fair on paper, but deadly in practice? And what if the players agreed to participate, not because they wanted to, but because the world outside the game had already become unlivable? At the time, no one wanted to make it. The script was considered too dark, too violent, too uncomfortable. It criticized economic systems too directly. It suggested that society itself was the problem. So the script sat untouched for years. But the world didn't get better. Debt grew. In South Korea, household debt climbed to some of the highest levels in the world. People borrowed to survive, not to thrive.
Credit cards, private lenders, high-interest loans, each one offering temporary relief while deepening long-term entrapment. Debt didn't just affect finances, it affected mental health, relationships, self-worth. Failure became something people carried alone. And this is where Squid Game becomes unsettling, not because of what it imagines, but because of what it mirrors. In the series, every participant is drowning in debt. Not one of them joins the game for fun. They join because they've reached the end of every other option. When they are briefly allowed to leave, most of them return. That moment confuses some viewers. Why go back? But in the real world, this decision happens every day. People return to abusive jobs, they accept dangerous work, they enter exploitative arrangements, not because they want to, but because survival demands it. Choice, under desperation, becomes an illusion. There's a moment in Squid Game where the rules are explained clearly. The games are fair, everyone has the same chance. This sounds comforting, familiar. It echoes the idea that society is merit-based, that effort determines outcome. But fairness in rules does not mean fairness in reality. Some players are older, some are injured, some are traumatized, some start with nothing, while others have connections, strength, or experience. The game doesn't account for this, and neither does the real world. The series uses childhood games for a reason. Childhood is supposed to be safe, predictable, innocent. By turning these games into instruments of death, the show exposes how systems take something familiar and weaponize it, how people are taught early that life is fair, only to discover later that it never was. There are also stories people whisper about. Rumors that Squid Game was inspired by real facilities where people were taken and never returned. One such place actually existed, Brothers' Home. Between the 1970s and 1980s, thousands of people in South Korea were forcibly detained in what was officially called a welfare center. In reality, it became a place of abuse. People were taken off the streets, sometimes simply for being poor or inconvenient. Inside, they were beaten, forced to work, starved, and in many cases, killed through neglect or violence. This happened openly, with government knowledge. No masks, no secrecy, just paperwork and silence. Squid Game does not directly recreate Brothers' Home, but the similarities are impossible to ignore. People stripped of names, reduced to numbers, removed from society, their suffering hidden behind authority. Then there are the VIPs. They don't touch the games. They don't risk anything. They watch. They represent something deeply unsettling, a class of people insulated from consequences. In real life, economic crises rarely harm the wealthiest first. Those with resources observe from a distance, they speculate, they profit, they remain untouched. The players bleed, the watchers don't. And this may be the most disturbing truth behind Squid Game, that it doesn't invent monsters, it shows systems functioning exactly as designed.
No one forces the players into the game. The system simply removes every other path. By the time Squid Game was finally released in 2021, the world was ready for it. Not because it had changed, but because it had worsened. A global pandemic had exposed inequality. Millions lost jobs. Debt exploded. Uncertainty became normal. Suddenly, the story wasn't extreme. It was recognizable. And that is why Squid Game terrified people. Not because it showed people dying,
but because it showed why they agreed to play. The truth is, there are no real underground death games. There are no islands where masked guards execute the poor for entertainment. But there are systems that quietly decide who survives and who doesn't. They don't wear uniforms. They don't announce themselves. They operate through policy, debt, labor, and silence. And that is the real horror behind Squid Game. Not the game itself, but the world that makes it believable. And when the final episode ends, when the screen fades to black and the credits roll, something uncomfortable lingers. Because the story doesn't resolve the way most stories do. There is money, there is survival, but there is no relief. Winning doesn't heal what was broken. And that, too, reflects real life. In reality, escaping poverty or debt doesn't erase the trauma of living inside it. People who survive economic collapse often carry invisible scars: fear of losing everything again, distrust of systems that once failed them, guilt for surviving when others didn't. Squid Game understands this. The winner doesn't walk away triumphant. He walks away hollow. This is important because it reveals the show's quiet accusation that even when the system allows someone to win, it still takes something irretrievable in return. And that accusation doesn't stop with individuals. It points upward. In Squid Game, the game exists because someone funded it, designed it, maintained it, approved every rule and every death. Yet those people remain distant, almost abstract. They are rarely named, rarely seen clearly. That distance mirrors how power operates in the real world. In factories closed, no single face is blamed. When debt crushes families, no one is arrested. When people break under pressure, it's called a personal failure, not a systemic one. Responsibility dissolves as it rises. This is why Squid Game doesn't offer a villain you can hate comfortably. There is no mastermind monologue that explains everything, no final confrontation that brings justice. Instead, there is an unsettling realization. The system doesn't need villains. It functions on incentives, indifference, and normalization. People ask whether Squid Game is exaggerated, but exaggeration implies distortion. What the series does instead is simplify. It strips away the complexity, the bureaucracy, the language that softens harm, and shows the outcome in its rawest form. Life becomes a game, people become pieces, loss becomes acceptable as long as the rules were followed. This logic already exists. It exists in workplaces where exhaustion is praised as dedication, in economies where housing becomes unaffordable but wages remain stagnant, in cultures where asking for help is seen as weakness. The show's most unsettling choice is not the violence, it's the fairness. The rules are explained, the contracts are signed, the illusion of consent is preserved. And because of that, the deaths are treated as acceptable outcomes rather than moral failures. This mirrors how society often responds to poverty. If someone fails, the assumption is that they didn't play well enough, didn't try hard enough, didn't make the right choices. But Squid Game quietly asks a different question. What if the game itself is the problem? What if the starting line was never equal? What if the rules were designed to eliminate most players by default? What if the prize only exists to justify the losses? These questions are uncomfortable because they don't allow easy answers. And that may be why Squid Game unsettled audiences across cultures, languages, and economic systems. People recognized the pressure, even if they didn't recognize the setting. The uniforms were unfamiliar, the debt was not. In many parts of the world, people live one emergency away from collapse, one illness, one layoff, one unexpected expense. For them, the fear in Squid Game isn't fictional, it's psychological. It's the constant awareness that stability is fragile and conditional. This is why the show doesn't need to be real to feel true. It reflects a world where survival is increasingly individualized, while risk is increasingly collective, where people compete against one another for shrinking opportunities, rather than questioning why those opportunities disappeared in the first place. And perhaps the most disturbing part is how easily viewers accept the premise. The games are horrifying, but understandable. The choices are brutal, but logical. That acceptance reveals something about us, too. We've become accustomed to systems that sacrifice many for the comfort of a few. We've learned to explain away suffering with terms like efficiency, growth, and market forces. We've learned to treat human lives as data points. Squid Game simply removes the euphemisms. It shows what happens when competition is taken to its logical extreme. And then it asks the viewer to sit with that realization. Because once you see it, it's difficult to unsee. The real horror of Squid Game is not that such a game could exist, it's that parts of it already do. Not in one place, not in one form, but scattered across labor markets, debt systems, healthcare structures, and social hierarchies worldwide. Quietly, legally, every day. And that is why the story doesn't end cleanly, because the world that inspired it hasn't ended either. The game is still running, just without the masks.
And maybe that is why the ending feels unresolved. Because resolution would imply closure. But there is none. The system that Squid Game reflects does not conclude. It adapts. It reshapes itself. It continues operating long after individual stories end. People enter it, struggle inside it, and disappear from it every day, rarely noticed, rarely remembered. In the real world, there is no prize ceremony. There is only survival, or the quiet aftermath of failure. What Squid Game exposes, without ever stating it directly, is how suffering becomes normalized when it is widespread. When everyone is under pressure, pressure feels ordinary. When everyone is competing, competition feels natural. And when people fall behind, their disappearance feels inevitable rather than tragic. This is how systems protect themselves. Not through force alone, but through belief. Belief that this is how things must be. Belief that there is no alternative. Belief that those who lose simply weren't strong enough. In the show, the players are numbered. Their names become secondary. This is efficient, easier to manage, easier to discard. And again, this isn't fictional logic. In real life, people become statistics. Unemployment rates, bankruptcy filings, productivity metrics. Human experience is reduced to data because data is easier to justify than grief. There is a moment in Squid Game where the frontman explains that the games are designed to be fair. Everyone has an equal chance. That statement is chilling, not because it's false, but because it mirrors how many real-world systems describe themselves. Fairness becomes a shield, a way to absolve responsibility. If the rules were fair, then the outcome must be fair too. But fairness of rules does not account for inequality of circumstance. A person who starts with nothing does not lose the same way as someone who starts with resources. A single mistake does not carry the same weight for everyone.
In Squid Game, some players can afford to take risks. Others cannot afford to hesitate. That difference is often the difference between life and death. This is true far beyond fiction. In workplaces, some can afford to speak up. Others cannot risk being noticed. In economies, some can afford failure. Others are ruined by it. In societies, some mistakes are forgiven. Others are fatal. The show doesn't invent this imbalance. It isolates it, magnifies it, and refuses to look away. And then there is the audience, both inside the show and outside of it. The VIPs watch the games as entertainment, but so do we. That discomfort is intentional, because it forces a question most viewers don't want to ask. At what point does observation become complicity? At what point does consuming suffering, as news, statistics, or entertainment, become a way of distancing ourselves from it? We tell ourselves it's just a show, but the emotions it triggers aren't fictional. They come from recognition of pressure, recognition of fear, recognition of the quiet panic that comes from knowing how thin the line is between stability and collapse. Squid Game doesn't scare people by inventing a nightmare. It scares them by revealing how close that nightmare already is. And perhaps that is why the story lingers so long after it ends. Because it doesn't ask whether you would survive the game. It asks something far more unsettling. How much of your life is already shaped by one? How many of your choices are truly free? How many are responses to pressure? How many dreams were abandoned, not because you failed, but because the cost of pursuing them became too high? These are not questions meant to be answered easily. They are meant to sit uncomfortably. Because once you start seeing the world through that lens, it becomes harder to ignore the patterns, harder to accept explanations that place all responsibility on individuals while absolving systems, harder to believe that suffering on this scale is accidental. The real legacy of Squid Game is not its visuals or its violence. It is the way it quietly reframes desperation as a structural outcome rather than a personal flaw. It doesn't ask us to pity the players. It asks us to understand them. And understanding is dangerous because it invites responsibility. Responsibility to question systems that benefit from competition without compassion. Responsibility to notice who is being pushed out, erased, or blamed. Responsibility to recognize that survival should not be a privilege awarded to the few. The show ends without comfort because comfort would betray its truth. There is no neat solution, no moral victory, no reset. Only the uneasy realization that the game doesn't require an island. It only requires inequality. And as long as that exists, the story of Squid Game will never truly end.
And yet, even after that realization settles in, there is a temptation to distance ourselves from it. To tell ourselves that Squid Game is about South Korea, about a specific culture, about an extreme version of capitalism that exists somewhere else. But that separation doesn't hold for long, because the forces the story exposes are not confined to one country or one system. They appear wherever survival is conditional, wherever people are ranked, filtered, and discarded according to usefulness, wherever worth is measured primarily in productivity and profit. In many places, the language is softer. There are no guns, no masked guards, no countdown clocks. Instead, there are deadlines, performance reviews, interest rates, waiting lists. But the effect is often the same. People learn to internalize pressure, to blame themselves when they fall behind, to accept exhaustion as normal, to normalize anxiety as the cost of existing. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary,
and what would once have felt intolerable becomes routine. This is how systems persist. They don't need constant enforcement. They rely on adaptation. People adapt to insecurity. They adapt to precarity. They adapt to living with just enough fear to keep moving. In Squid Game, the fear is immediate and visible. In real life, it's slow and ambient. It hums in the background of daily decisions, what job to take, what risks to avoid, what dreams to postpone indefinitely. It teaches people to aim lower, to settle, to survive rather than imagine something better. That quiet narrowing of possibility is one of the most damaging outcomes of all, because when imagination disappears, resistance becomes harder. The characters in Squid Game don't overthrow the system. Most of them never even question it. They turn on each other instead. They form temporary alliances. They betray. They fight over scraps of advantage. This isn't because they are cruel by nature. It's because the structure rewards division and punishes solidarity. This, too, is familiar. When resources are scarce, people compete. When security is limited, trust erodes. When survival feels personal, collective action feels risky. The system doesn't have to destroy community directly. It only has to make cooperation feel dangerous. And perhaps that is the most accurate part of the series, not the violence, but the isolation. Each player is surrounded by others, yet fundamentally alone. Their depths are private, their shame is personal, their failures feel singular, even though they're widespread. In the real world, this isolation is reinforced constantly. Success stories are celebrated, failure stories are hidden. People see winners everywhere and assume they're the only ones struggling. The result is silence, and silence protects the system better than force ever could. Squid Game breaks that silence by making suffering visible. It refuses to let the audience look away. It doesn't allow suffering to remain abstract. It gives it faces, voices, histories. It reminds us that behind every statistic is a person who once believed things would turn out differently. This is why the show resonates most strongly with those who have experienced precarity, those who have lived paycheck to paycheck, those who have felt the weight of debt, illness, or instability pressing in on every decision. For them, the story isn't shocking, it's recognizable. And recognition can be unsettling, because it raises another question, one that lingers long after the final scene. If the game is this pervasive, what would it take to stop playing? The series doesn't answer that, and perhaps it can't, because stopping the game would require more than individual choice. It would require collective change, structural change, a willingness to question assumptions that have been treated as natural for generations. Assumptions like competition is inevitable, inequality is unavoidable, some people must lose for others to win. These ideas are rarely challenged because they're presented as facts rather than choices. Squid Game doesn't argue against them directly. It simply shows where they lead, and in doing so, it leaves the audience with discomfort rather than resolution, with awareness rather than comfort, with questions rather than answers. That discomfort is not a flaw, it is the point. Because stories that reassure rarely change anything. Stories that unsettle, that linger, that refuse to be neatly resolved, those are the ones that stay with us. Those are the ones that force reflection. In the end, Squid Game is not asking whether you would survive its games. It is asking whether you recognize the one you are already in, and whether, now that you see it, You can still pretend it isn't there.
And once that question is asked, it doesn't easily fade. Because recognition changes the way the world looks. After Squid Game, it becomes harder to see job listings as neutral opportunities rather than filters. Harder to see debt as a personal failing rather than a structural trap. Harder to see burnout as dedication rather than damage. The series quietly reframes experiences many people already carry, giving them a language, and in doing so, removing the comfort of ignorance. That removal is unsettling, because if the pressure is systemic, then endurance alone is not a solution. If the game is designed to eliminate most players, then working harder does not guarantee safety. And if survival depends on conditions beyond individual control, then the narratives we tell about success and failure begin to unravel. This is where Squid Game becomes most dangerous, not because it incites fear, but because it invites skepticism. Skepticism toward systems that demand loyalty without offering protection. Skepticism toward metrics that claim objectivity while ignoring context. Skepticism toward the idea that suffering is simply the cost of progress. The series doesn't present this skepticism as rebellion, it presents it as awareness, a quiet shift in perception, a refusal to fully accept the story we've been told about how the world works. And yet, awareness alone does not dismantle a system. The show understands this too. The winner doesn't expose the game, the world doesn't change, the structure remains intact. That ending frustrates some viewers, but it is deliberately honest. Change, when it comes, is rarely dramatic. It is slow, uneven, and often resisted. What Squid Game does instead is document. It documents how people behave under extreme pressure, how morality bends when survival is at stake, how kindness becomes costly, how desperation erodes principles that once felt non-negotiable. None of this is presented as inherent evil. It is presented as human response. And that distinction matters, because it shifts the focus away from blaming individuals and toward examining conditions. It asks what kind of world produces these behaviors, and then shows that world functioning exactly as intended. The discomfort viewers feel is not just empathy for the characters, it is recognition of vulnerability. The realization that many of us are closer to the edge than we like to believe. That stability, for most people, is conditional and temporary. This realization can lead to defensiveness. Some reject the message. Some minimize it. Some insist it's exaggerated. But exaggeration is often just clarity without filters. In real life, suffering is diluted across time and bureaucracy. It's hidden behind language like downsizing, efficiency, market correction. Squid Game removes that language. It compresses years of pressure into moments. It turns invisible harm into visible consequence. And by doing so, it exposes something uncomfortable, that many systems rely on the quiet acceptance of loss, that they function because people adapt rather than resist, that endurance becomes a substitute for justice. The series never claims to offer solutions. It offers evidence. Evidence that when survival is scarce, humanity is rationed. Evidence that fairness can coexist with cruelty. Evidence that systems can be legal, normalized, and still devastating. These are not revelations for everyone, but for those who see themselves in the players, in their fear, their calculations, their compromises. The story hits differently. It doesn't feel like entertainment. It feels like a mirror held a little too close. And perhaps that is why Squid Game became a global phenomenon rather than a niche thriller.
because the game it depicts is not culturally specific. It is structurally familiar. The uniforms may change, the rules may be phrased differently, the consequences may be slower, but the logic remains the same. And once you recognize that logic, it becomes difficult to fully return to the comfort of not seeing it. The series ends, but the awareness continues. And with that awareness comes a choice. Not a simple one, not an easy one, but a real one. Whether to accept the game as inevitable or to question why it exists at all.
In that choice, the quiet, relentless pressure to conform or to endure is the heart of Squid Game's unsettling power. Because the story makes clear that most people never get a true choice at all. They are born into circumstances, social hierarchies, and debts they did not create. And yet, they are expected to navigate these systems as if the outcome depended solely on their merit, their effort, or their moral compass. For the characters in the series, the stakes are literal life and death. For millions of real people around the world, the stakes are slower, quieter, but no less deadly. Chronic stress, overwhelming debt, systemic unemployment, and social isolation may not end lives in a single moment, but they erode them over years, sometimes decades. Every paycheck that barely covers the next one, every medical bill that threatens financial ruin, every eviction notice that looms silently in the corner. These are the slow games of survival that society plays without announcing the rules. Squid Game makes this visible, concentrated, and undeniable. It forces viewers to confront a truth most prefer to ignore, that suffering is not always a result of personal failure, but often of systems designed to create winners at the expense of many. And the more comfortable you feel with that idea, the more disturbing the story becomes. Because it isn't distant, it's right there, reflected in the choices we make, the pressures we accept, and the inequalities we normalize. Perhaps the most haunting element of the series is how it depicts human behavior under these conditions. It is not the violence that shocks most people. It is how ordinary people respond. They form alliances, betray friends, make impossible moral calculations. They cheat, they lie, they survive, and they suffer psychologically, carrying guilt, grief, and trauma that no reward can erase. This is not fictional. Psychological research has shown that humans in high-stakes, high-pressure environments behave in ways that mirror Squid Game. Desperation changes ethics. Scarcity changes trust. Survival instincts override idealism. And when systems are designed to magnify scarcity, these behaviors are predictable. And yet, within the narrative, there is also empathy. Small acts of kindness shine even brighter against the backdrop of danger. Moments of solidarity, brief mercies, or sacrifices for others stand out precisely because the system discourages them. They are fragile, fleeting, and often punished, but they remind viewers that humanity can persist even in the harshest conditions. That tension, the coexistence of brutality and compassion, is what makes the story feel so real. It mirrors the human experience in extreme economic and social environments. The despair is authentic. The moral compromise is believable. The rare moments of grace are painfully moving. By the end, the series leaves viewers unsettled because it refuses to offer closure. Winning does not erase trauma. Survival does not guarantee peace. Systems remain intact. Debt remains. Inequality persists.
And outside the fiction, in the real world, the pressures that inspired the story continue unabated. People continue to navigate invisible games, many of which are far more dangerous than the stylized competitions on the screen. In this way, Squid Game functions less as entertainment and more as reflection. It holds a mirror up to societies built on precarious labor, unequal opportunity, and silent coercion. It asks viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about the structures they inhabit, the pressures they normalize, and the ways in which human life is quietly rationed. And in the lingering discomfort that follows, one question remains, unspoken but unavoidable. If the world itself is the game, what are we willing to do to survive? And how much are we willing to accept before we demand that the rules be changed? Because the game, in one form or another, is still running. It has no masks, no guards, no cameras, but the logic remains. Survival is conditional. The stakes are high, and the consequences of failure are real. And when we leave the story behind, when the screen goes dark and the fictional players disappear, the truth remains. The most dangerous games are not the ones we watch, they are the ones we are already living.
And as the story lingers in our minds, it becomes impossible to ignore the patterns behind it. The people in Squid Game are fictional, but the forces shaping their choices are not. Around the world, countless individuals navigate systems designed for efficiency, profit, or survival, where failure is inevitable for the majority and only a rare few win. They don't wear numbered uniforms, they don't sign contracts in neon-lit rooms, but the rules are no less unforgiving. Debt, the series shows us, is not just a financial instrument. It is a weapon. It is a cage. It is a silent authority that forces decisions and narrows possibilities. People take loans they cannot repay, often without full understanding of the consequences. They gamble with borrowed money, hoping to climb out of their situation, only to find that the system has no interest in letting them succeed. Interest accumulates, penalties multiply, opportunities shrink, and slowly, without fanfare, lives are eroded. In South Korea, this has been a documented crisis for years. Household debt is among the highest in the world, often exceeding the total value of annual income. Families carry this burden across generations. And while policymakers debate numbers and rates, human beings, like the characters in the series, carry stress, shame, and desperation. They make choices that outsiders would call reckless, yet those decisions are perfectly rational under pressure. Choosing to participate in a game with deadly stakes is extreme fiction, but choosing to take one more loan, to gamble to survive, to sacrifice mental health for income, these are choices millions make quietly, daily. Even more revealing is the psychological toll of such pressure. Research in behavioral psychology shows that when individuals face prolonged scarcity, whether of money, food, or stability, their ethical frameworks, social bonds, and long-term planning can shift dramatically. Compassion diminishes when survival is at stake. Trust becomes a liability. Moral compromise becomes survival strategy. And yet, even in these extreme conditions, people still strive to maintain dignity, fairness, and empathy where they can, a dynamic that Squid Game portrays with uncanny accuracy. But desperation is not just individual, it is collective. Large-scale unemployment, housing crises, and systemic inequality push entire communities into scarcity.
In these conditions, the instinct to compete overtakes cooperation because the system rewards winners and punishes the rest. The show exaggerates this with lethal consequences, but in reality, the results are subtle, cumulative, and often invisible. Families fractured, friendships tested, mental health deteriorated, opportunities lost forever. The historical echoes of Squid Game are equally striking. In South Korea, labor disputes like the Ssangyong motor strike in 2009 revealed how far corporations and authorities would go to protect economic interests at the expense of human well-being. Workers were removed forcibly, their protests were suppressed, lives were damaged, many never fully recovered. These events, among others, inspired Hwang Dong-hyuk not with a sense of horror fiction, but with the raw reality of systemic inequity. The show translates decades of social pressure, labor tension, and economic stress into a metaphorical arena where the stakes are literally life and death. And yet, the series does not dwell only on despair. It reminds us of the fragile, flickering resilience of human beings. Acts of kindness, fleeting solidarity, and rare moments of moral courage punctuate the story. A shared meal, a whispered warning, a decision to protect another. These gestures are small, almost fragile, but they illuminate the enduring humanity that persists even when systems are dehumanizing. In reality, people do the same. Neighbors help each other despite scarcity. Communities form support networks despite institutional neglect. And strangers sometimes intervene when others are vulnerable. Even in the most calculated, cold systems, human connection persists. Squid Game also asks uncomfortable questions about power and distance. The VIPs, the spectators who gamble on the lives of others, represent a broader truth. Systems are maintained by those insulated from consequence. Wealth, influence, and authority provide distance from the harm they observe or facilitate. In the real world, this takes many forms. Corporate executives who profit while workers struggle, policymakers who legislate without experiencing the consequences of their laws, and institutions that manage populations as numbers rather than humans. The distance softens accountability, it normalizes cruelty, and it ensures that the game continues. Perhaps the most haunting element is that the game, in both the series and reality, does not require spectacle to function. Squid Game compresses years of systemic pressure into a few brutal rounds. In real life, the rounds are long and imperceptible. They take the form of unpaid labor, predatory lending, high-interest debt, inaccessible health care, and social stigma. The danger is slow, the cost is cumulative, and because the stakes are rarely explicit, people rarely recognize the rules they are already playing by until it is too late. The series ends with the unsettling truth that even survival is not liberation. Winning the game does not undo the trauma endured. The character who survives carries the weight of the choices, the deaths witnessed, and the moral compromises made. In life, survival in oppressive systems is similarly double-edged. Even those who succeed often pay hidden costs: stress-related illnesses, broken relationships, anxiety, depression, and a lingering awareness of the system's cruelty. Survival is not triumph, it is endurance. And when the story lingers in the viewer's mind, it asks an unspoken question. If the world is already structured as a game of winners and losers, how do we live within it without becoming complicit? Every decision, every compromise, every silent acceptance of injustice becomes part of the game. The narrative is not just a warning, it is an invitation to see the invisible systems around us, to recognize patterns that allow suffering to persist, and to question why society permits these pressures to continue unchecked. Squid Game does not end with clarity because the reality it reflects does not offer clarity. Systems persist, inequality endures, debt accumulates, people struggle, and just like the fictional players, many are trapped in cycles with no obvious exit. The series leaves us with the raw, uncomfortable awareness that the most powerful games are those we do not recognize as games at all. And that is the real horror. Not the masks, not the games, not even the violence. The true horror is that the world, as it functions, already plays the game with us. And the stakes are nothing less than our lives, our dignity, and our humanity. Then here, finally, the story must end. Not with resolution, but with reflection. Because the most important lesson of Squid Game is not in the games themselves, or in who survives, or in who falls. It is in what the story reveals about the world we live in, the systems we accept, the pressures we normalize, and the hidden games that shape our lives every day. We watch the players struggle, betray, sacrifice, and endure, and we see ourselves in them. Not because we are in danger of literal death, but because we live in a world where survival is conditional, where inequality persists, where debt and pressure shape choices long before we are aware of them. The masks are gone, the arenas dissolve, the games end, but the systems continue, and so does the question. How do we live within these structures without losing ourselves? How do we preserve humanity, compassion, and dignity when the rules around us are designed to test them constantly? Squid Game does not answer these questions. It does not provide consolation or closure. Its power lies in its honesty, its willingness to show the human cost of inequality, the consequences of desperation, and the fragility of life under pressure. It holds up a mirror, and in that reflection, we cannot look away. And in that lingering reflection, there is perhaps the only hope the story offers: awareness, understanding, recognition. The first step toward change is seeing the game for what it is and asking ourselves whether we will continue to play or whether we will begin to change the rules. Because the game is still running, and whether we notice it or not, we are all already part of it.